What's the approach? The approach with caring for this student was based upon Swanson's five caring processes, which was to actually develop empathy. And we develop empathy by understanding the history and the culture of the population that we are interested in recruiting. Being with is really some of those interpersonal skills that I mentioned, authentically and genuinely being with your participant in that moment and not treating them as if they're just another number for your study. Enabling or advocating for your population. So really, again, this is about partnering and enabling your population to do what they believe is best for them instead of you dictating that for them. Doing for, I love this one. And my student, who was an expert recruiter, talks about this all the time. What are you doing for the community? How are you being of service in the community? So it's not just about diving into a community, recruiting, collecting your data, and then exiting left, but how are you being of service? How are you showing up in the community and making sure that this is a place that you want to be, you intend to be for some time, and that you are doing things that are mutually beneficial? And so maintaining belief is really about believing in this population that they have the capacity to know and do what's best for them, and that you are supporting that mission. So part of my love, as I mentioned, is working with young people. And excuse the typo, that should say homelessness and not homeless. But the population that I worked with, mostly in Chicago for my own research, was really youth who had been experiencing homelessness and or adversity. And I did that through adopting a family intervention that was originally developed at UCLA for youth experiencing homelessness. However, I wanted to make sure that it was appropriate and acceptable to the youth in Chicago. Youth in Chicago, particularly in the homeless shelters, are overwhelmingly Black and African American. And I also, they can also be gender sexual minority youth, so gay, lesbian, bi, and trans youth. And so I really wanted to take my time and not just throw an intervention at them without really exploring if this is the intervention that is best for them. And particularly around their background and culture and experiences in Chicago. And so these papers and the book chapter that's written with Dr. Milburn at UCLA really talks about their experiences and how we might approach them and their families to disrupt intergenerational health inequities. And so I'd love to share our participants' voices. And that paper really summarizes some themes that we learned through our focus groups with the youth in Chicago. And so the first one I would like to call setting the stage. And what you'll see is some repetition in my presentation. I'm learning over and over and over again that you really need to set the stage and have some empathy and understand where your population is coming from. And so some of this is really around establishing youth advisory boards, being really intentional about cultural humility, and having discussions with your team. So you might have a team that is not culturally congruent, meaning that they haven't had the lived experience, but that doesn't mean you can't then hold them accountable and have these discussions and bring in people that do have that lived experience so that they have a better understanding of who they are attempting to work with. Protect and hold was another theme, and this is because I work in dyad. So I typically recruit not only a young person into my studies, but also a family member or caregiver. And so it's important to hold the parent, like you understand where the parent is coming from, but you 100% have to back or advocate for the youth. So that is something really important to consider as you are balancing the needs of who you're recruiting. The next one is about walking the safety tightrope. And so, because I work with youth who have experienced adversity or homelessness or even at risk for sexual exploitation, you need to have a safety plan. You need to understand that safety is paramount with these populations. And so, how are you going to be prepared to work with those youth? One of the things that I've done is I've created referral-based recruitment strategies. So oftentimes my youth are working with other organizations or agencies, and I partner with that agency to then recruit them into the study. And part of the reason for doing that is because then I know that there is some support around them, because I can't always expect my study or my intervention to be the end all be all of the support that this young person might need. And I'm gonna speed along because my alarm has already went off that I'm 15 minutes in. So some of the other things that we've learned, as I mentioned, working with families is building upon existing strengths. Again, that emotional IQ, how are you creating a positive atmosphere and being non-judgmental and empathic in your approach? Facilitating communication and problem solving, and offering interventions to the whole household, which may look different. Family composition is changing over the years, and sometimes it might not be a traditional mom or dad that you are intervening with. And so really considering who's in the household and how your intervention might benefit the entire household. Prioritizing cultural relevance is also something really important, and I've talked about it before, so I won't belabor the point here, but some of the things I've learned being in Southern California is really around language and language barriers, and perhaps the need to offer an intervention in multiple languages, and how that might be important to really secure funding, even in the pilot stage, to translate documents, et cetera, because that's the population that I'm going to be working with. And so really planning and investing in that upfront is something that is crucial. And finally, maximizing flexibility. I know in research, we like for things to be quite structured and controlled, but in community engaged research, you need to have some flexibility. And so how might you offer your intervention? Will you have hybrid opportunities? Will you be mobile in terms of your delivery and your assessments? I know that some of the adjustments that I've had to make in some of my studies here is that instead of expecting my participants to come to me here at UCI, that I have to get in the car and drive to them and see them, whether that be in McDonald's, or coffee shops, or their own homes. And so really mitigating transportation barriers when you are able to get them to you, but when you're not, being able to go to them. Topic 4 is about resistance, and because of time, I'm not going to spend much time on it, but I did send that paper out for you to review. To summarize, it's really an ecological framework that considers the way that we are perceiving young people might be in response to some of the dominant institutional responses, particularly to ethnic and racially minoritized youth. And so perhaps the way that we are approaching things are creating responses that we might label as abnormal or deviant, but we really need to consider the context in which our participants live, and perhaps some of their responses are normative and strengths-based and resilient. So to end, I'd just like to share some of the things that are supported by the ICTS, CCRI studies that I am currently involved in. And that has really been a focus in partnering with marginalized populations to amplify their voices. And we've done that. Our 2022 project was in a drop-in center in Orange County, working with youth who were at risk for sexual exploitation and actually using photos to collect data. So the point of this is really to say that sometimes the traditional ways we think about collecting data don't match our participants' needs. And so we need to be a little bit more creative in how we consider data collection and what's going to resonate with our participants. The other study is me working with my CYFER lab members to really explore what restoring can look like. And so that resistance article talks a little bit about how restoring for marginalized populations is something that is really important and strengths-based in terms of letting them be the authors of their own lives, despite the oppression and adversity that they may have experienced. So I have my references here. I'm absolutely happy to share these slides and really want to thank you for your time and allow some time for questions.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Bounds. This was, I mean, this was great for me. And I was even taking notes, right? Some of the things that really jumped out at me in your presentation related, like the ideas of embedding yourself, right, among trusted stakeholders, right, and the relationships that we build and how that allows us to engage with marginalized communities, I think is amazing. You're getting lots of hand claps over here because it was really phenomenal. And then I also love the comments you made around getting away from the deficit-based terminology, right? Like shifting from the person to the environment, because we tend to do that, right? Like, and I think many of you know I'm in Long Beach, and a lot of times we'll use the person experiencing homeless, right? Instead of talking about like someone being homeless, right? Like instead of it being who you are, right? It's a state that you happen to be in. And it's a standard of it's your environment, it's your lived experience, but it is not inherent to who you are, right? And being really mindful when we're talking to these communities, right? Around the types of language we use. And I think the resilience framework you were talking about at the end there really brings that to bear, right? Around the fact that sometimes we adopt things that we think are like standard language, right? That we don't realize how they're coming off to the communities that we're choosing to serve, right? And eliciting the responses that you were talking about. So yeah, again, amazing. And I think we already have a couple of questions. So I'm going to go first to Margaret and then to Pam.
Thank you. Dawn, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, great. Thank you. That was fantastic. I really appreciate your presentation. And I have a question about the study that you talked about in the article on the tripartite model. I was really struck by the sophisticated technology that you used in that study for tracking the recruitment process. And I can imagine how that would really improve your ability to recruit. And I'm just curious from your impressions, to what extent do you think that technology innovation is responsible for boosting recruitment as compared to the cultural compatibility element? I mean, what's the balance there?
Oh my goodness, it's such a wonderful question. And as I mentioned, having those experiences during my PhD program influenced like who I am today in terms of that study infrastructure. And so it is really important to invest that time up front, because otherwise you're going to lose time during the process. And so I think it's as valuable. I won't say it's more valuable because I do think that cultural congruence is paramount, but it's not always realistic that you have it, right? Like we can't always recruit our research team to look like the folks that we are recruiting. We should make efforts to do so, but I do think that you can be successful with things like having that study infrastructure and technology and tracking study participants and referrals and recruitment efforts. Being really structured and intentional about that, I think can make up the difference.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Ms. Pam.
Thank you, Joni. I agree with Joni, Dawn. That was a fantastic, and Margaret, fantastic presentation. And I took notes too, which isn't something I always do, but so much of what you said was worthwhile. And I did feel like you were preaching to the choir of me. I wanted to like cheer a few times, but it was such good reminders about language deficit-based terms. And my question is two things. One is about the non-resident dads. I was actually curious as to how that's defined. And the second, which I think was a real key to your success, was the infrastructure, because that infrastructure had to be thought out ahead of time while you were writing the grant. It's not something you can build later and just find the dollars to fill that. So I was curious about the term, and then also how you built that infrastructure into the grant.
Thanks, Pamela. So for one, non-resident African American fathers, non-resident means that the child did not live with the father more than half time. So it was less than a shared custody situation. And so that study in particular focused on those dads because there was lots of work around and stigma and a dominant narrative that Black fathers are absent. And so this study was really focused on those fathers that wanted to be present in their child's lives, even if they didn't share custody or that child didn't live with them more than half time.
Okay, that's fantastic.
Yeah, in terms of study infrastructure, I was not a part of writing that grant in particular. However, we had a team that had used things like Access, et cetera, that we were able to build. And some of it was actually building as we flew that plane. And I will say, since I've been here at UCI, I've leveraged RedCap not only for data collection, but also for tracking a lot of things. And so my RedCap databases have been massive intentionally so that I can track incentives and recruitment, et cetera, in ways that perhaps RedCap isn't traditionally used. And so that's like a free way to actually invest, but it's a time investment for sure. Using things like
in my former life, for 20 years, I ran a home health company that worked with low-income pregnant women and their families. And often people would ask me what was the single most important thing we did. And always my answer was involving the fathers from the very beginning, that they understand their role and how important they are. I think if we did nothing to change the world or change a life, the most important thing we did was involve the fathers.
absolutely.
So, yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks for that, Pam. And I feel like I just learned something new about you. Donovan, I know in our conversations about the article, you had mentioned you had some questions about the tracking and the metrics as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you, Dr. Bounds. This was an incredible presentation and some really awesome work. You had mentioned during your talk even how one of the recruiters that you had trained, they had been so instrumental in this work. My question, especially since keeping the team of recruiters seems to be a challenge for these types of studies, is if that varying level of experience with the recruiters or bringing in new people, if that had any impact on their ability to recruit or the participants, and if there's just any way to track that, having maybe more experienced people kind of target the more vulnerable populations, or how you can address that shortcoming.
This is an age-old question that we struggled with a lot in terms of research assistants in particular. I was just having this conversation the other day around, half-time positions for research assistants who may or may not be a student or a graduate student, et cetera, versus someone who actually this is their love and passion and career. And do we, create full-time positions for those folks and actually keep them over the long run? And I think that, for longer term studies, that might be the way to go. We can still involve students in our research in other ways, and they can be volunteers. Like CYFER Lab has lots of volunteers. However, some of that money and investment might need to be in a full-time position, because you might retain someone longer and that might benefit your study. And having folks that are embedded in community already, it might be somebody that was a community health worker. That might be the better way to go. So I think we haven't figured it out yet. And I can't say that I have data to support my response, but it's more based upon like my experiences. We definitely struggled with that during the DAD study. We started off with half-time positions and said, maybe we need to hire somebody full time. Like this halftime thing, like the revolving door was not working out, and our study was suffering as a result of it.
Excellent point. Dan.
Don, thanks so much for your talk. We really appreciate it. I want you to comment on something and maybe give us some insight. And we're obviously going to need you for, the CTSA is embarking on a pretty big experiment, which is working with CERM and the School of Medicine. We've hired a research-focused navigator to work at the FQHCs. So, UCI owns 2 federally qualified health centers. They serve a predominantly minoritized, underserved population, as you know. And there still is a need for research. And obviously, all of the issues that you've raised are important for being able to recruit. So there's kind of 2 issues there. And one is, I'd like your comment or your thoughts about this. And this is a point that was raised by Mark Rothstein, who's on the call, and he is an outstanding ethicist, and something that really got me thinking, Mark. And that is, if we recruit or we ask anybody from any community to participate in a clinical trial, do we have an obligation to answer the following question, which is, if the device or drug that we are studying is proved to be useful, will this person who volunteered for this study be able to afford or gain access to the ultimate product? And I know this is a question that's been around for a long time, but when Mark raised it, it really crystallized in my mind how critical this is. So I'd like, one, we're going to need your help as we develop this program, because one of the things that we're doing with the FQHCs is that because there is a CERM contribution, that one of the kinds of studies are these, regenerative and cellular medicine studies, which can be very off-putting to a minoritized and underserved community. So I'd like your thoughts about this, Donna. We're going to recruit you to help us out, by the way, obviously, as we move forward with this.
That's an excellent question, and absolutely an ethical dilemma that I think needs to be brought to a community advisory board of some sort to really talk about what is the obligation of what's our obligation in that situation. I think it's something that really needs to get dug into and explored further and discussed, so that there's an investment up front. If the answer to that question is yes, then how do we make that happen? And is it feasible to make it happen? And if not, then do we need to go back and reconsider how we are approaching these studies?
Right. And Don, even with Ozempic and those drugs, they're rapidly getting priced out of many, insurances are dropping them. We have issues around it, but for people who need them, they can be extremely useful. If you can't afford them, then why did we do this? And then with the cellular and regenerative therapies, they tend to be very expensive. Mm-hmm. And before we start enrolling participants to do research, I think we're obligated to at least consider some of those issues.
Absolutely. I would agree that you're absolutely obligated to consider it beforehand.
Ms. Dara.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Don. I've been really wanting to hear you talk. And so when I saw you on the agenda, I was so excited, and I could hear you talk 100 times more and not get enough. I want more.
It went way too fast. I'll say that. I was like, oh my goodness.
Way too fast. I just like you gave us a little taste, and now I want more. I have a very concrete question. In the last couple of weeks, I have been so part of my role in the ICTS is community engagement. And ironically, in the past couple of weeks, including just on our community advisory board, we had a investigative team come and say, okay, how do I get started working with the Black African American community in Orange County? And I guess my question to you is, and these are people who have, they have some skill in how to do community-based research. So the question is not, how do I do community-based research, but where do I start in Orange County? And so how did you start? How did you take everything that you learned? Where does one start in Orange County to build these relationships?
That's a wonderful question. I will say a couple of things. And given that I work with youth who I'm looking for the right term because the terms we use are the terms I'm telling you not to use, right? But vulnerable youth, I'll say it, but vulnerable because they have experienced homelessness, have experienced sexual exploitation, et cetera, right? And so the community organizations that work with those populations are extremely protective of those youth, as they should be. And if they weren't, I'd probably be side-eyeing them and questioning, is this the right organization for me to work with? So I would say that at first I started at UCI. I started with the student here. So that was number one. And then I have to admit, like I'm on a board now for Project Hope Alliance that works with youth experiencing homelessness. And that resulted through somebody hearing me speak and introducing me to Jennifer Friend, because they just knew that we had similar passions and interests. And so I've been working with Jennifer. Initially, I wasn't a board member. I was just somebody that was like loving the youth and wanting to serve. And I was eventually invited to serve on their board. And part of what I've been doing is building out their youth advisory council. And so again, I'm living what I'm preaching. I'm coming and serving. And so, I mean, I don't recruit necessarily. I'm not embedded to recruit directly from Project Hope Alliance, but yeah, I share my flyers here and there. But really, I'm there helping them build their youth advisory council. Similarly, with my partnership with Orangewood Foundation, it was through, I wrote a grant with Corey Rude and Jody Cross. And so they had existing relationships. And again, I was just signing up to serve, to say, like, we need to do better with healthcare for youth who've been sexually exploited. And that eventually resulted in being in a meeting where they were saying that they had a need. They needed more health education in a drop-in center. And I'm like, well, I can do that. I can go, and do some health education. And we were able to, write to the CCRI and say, well, let's do a needs assessment there. And so I think it's about really finding those, the needs, like what are the needs of the community first, and how might I be of service to those needs? And from that relationship, I think can be research. So it's almost kind of like flipping it on its head in a way.
I think what you said that is so key is you're of service first. You went into the community, not looking for patients, not looking for money, but looking to be of service. And then from that, all things flow.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then to follow up on Pam and you, Dawn. Yeah, like the word I always hear, like when I was campaigning, people would always talk about like they're not interested in people being extractive, right? Like people are always coming to these communities wanting something from them, right? Like, I want you to be in my study. I need you to do something for me, as opposed to the perspective of like the relationship building you're talking about, Dawn, and embedding yourself in that community, saying, how can I be of service? In that process, I'm now developing the relationships necessary for me to be effective at my own research, but that takes a level of intentionality and time, right? Which I don't know that we always appreciate, but that's what's necessary when you want to actually do community-based research. So that's fantastic. I had actually had a question I wanted to ask you, Dawn, and I know you talked about the fact that whenever you do interventions, and I thought this was great, right? Like the intervention is not just to the person, right? But the intervention is to the family, right? And I would think it's maybe even in a broader sense, like almost to the community, right? Like the idea is that like, okay, how is this intervention going to affect a community of people, right? Not just an individual, which I love. And so a question for you is kind of thinking throughout that intervention, are study participants encouraged to kind of interact with one another? To what extent our community kind of attitude, so like the attitudes that participants might have about one another, like how do those inform kind of the evaluation of outcomes and like the outcomes and endpoints you're looking at?
Oh man, things I'm struggling with in my life right now, Joni. So building bridges to fatherhood, actually, we recruited dyads as well. We recruited the non-resident African-American father. We also recruited the mother of the child, which was a challenge, right? Because this was, at times these were not really good relationships. But the point, the focus, the goal was that influencing the father's skills, the father's investment and time with that child was important. And so it was, man, it was rough. So we actually collected data from the father, and then we collected some data from the mother as well. A lot of that data was on the child in particular, because the child predominantly lived with the mother. So that's one example. The studies that I've been conducting have been youth caregiver dyads or youth positive supportive adult dyads, right? And so I've been collecting, my study in Chicago was collecting data from the youth. It was collecting it from their, we say caregiver or positive supportive adult. They were mostly parents in that study. And so the data we collected from them was actually about the youth. I have shifted since I've been here in Southern California, and now I collect data from the youth. I also collect data from that caregiver, but the data from the caregiver is now about the caregiver instead of about the youth, because I'm like, I want to know more about how we are also impacting the caregiver in this intervention. So a lot of times my target is the youth, right? Ultimately, the outcomes I want to impact the youth, but I think that understanding the context in which the youth is living in that household in particular, I want to know about the caregiver. My mixed method study that I'm doing now, again, you can tell I'm heavy social ecological model, right? So I'm looking at not only the youth, but I'm also looking at the school. I'm looking at their neighborhood / community as well. And so really starting to branch out, because you're right. We have to not only, and particularly when we're talking about social determinants of health, this is not just about that individual, but about the environment that they're in. So great question.
Amazing answer.
Thank you, Dr. Bounds. I'd like to piggyback on Dara's question about Orange County. You came from Chicago. I came from Washington, D.C. Orange County is a weird bird. It has, as you know, less than 2% of African Americans in the county. Yes. Median household income is above $100,000. Yet there is rising rates of poverty. About 10%, I believe, in the county. And I guess my question, it has to do, strategies of recruitment must be different or more difficult because it's probably scattered. But then I'm also thinking, when I was at Assurance National, right in the middle of DC, across the street from Howard, in a sense, the diversity of the families coming was incredible. That's not the case here because it takes an effort to come to large centers. So, and plus, I've been thinking two things. One, so how did you adapt your recruitment strategies to the current situation? And second, is there an effect for communities where the sense of community is important, but it also requires numbers, critical mass, which you do have in Long Beach and in LA, but I'm just not sure about Orange County.
Yeah, and it's something that I'm struggling. I'm still struggling and still learning. So to be completely transparent, it's been challenging to make that adjustment. And I think that I've made it in a couple of ways, but it's still going to take some work. One is right now I'm not recruiting just African American population. I'm recruiting youth impacted by adversity, which a lot of times are the youth who are minoritized, right? And so one example that I'll give, particularly about my experience in Orange County, is A, I was like, oh my goodness, where am I going to find Black youth? But B, I'll tell you, going to that drop-in center in Santa Ana, I've never seen so many Black youth in my life. And so these are youth who are experiencing housing instability that are using the drop-in center. I was struck by the lack of Black people I see around Orange County, but then at this one particular place, there were Black youth everywhere. And so, I think that, partnering with those places and spaces, and I will say that that drop-in center in particular, eventually this will be written up and published, does an amazing job of really trauma-informed care in terms of the environment that they've created for youth to want to keep coming back there. So I'm Eric, I wish I had a better answer. I feel like I'm still struggling.
No, I mean, it's not, I mean, there are all sorts of diversities in Orange County, but it must be different strategies for when you want to be helpful and open to, populations that are, real minorities, less than 2% is not much.
Yeah.
Dan, you had I see your hand.
Thanks, Eric. Don, one of the things that you mentioned was we want to train people, and you mentioned things that I guess we can't train people to do, like, to be more sensitive, and other things we can't. Don, how do we put into play a mechanism where we ensure that everybody is trained this way? Because as you point out, we're not always going to have a match between the people in the research and the ethnic or racial, complexion of the people in the study. And that, I don't think that's always necessarily a barrier if we can train ourselves well, so I'd appreciate your thoughts about that. How do we ensure that an organization like CTSA, and we're supposed to be, training the next generation, any thoughts about how we can improve that?
Sure. The first example that comes to mind is, I know for some of the ICTS grant mechanisms, there was a required webinar that I had to attend before I applied. So that's the first one that comes to mind, that you attach the training, attach the funding to the training.
And if I may interrupt, so you found that useful though?
Yeah.
That's good to know, because sometimes we just do these things and we check a box and we don't really know if they helped. And it's really good feedback for us to know if in fact that was useful.
Absolutely. And so in terms of, like you say, well, how do we get everyone trained? I think you have to embed it in the existing structure. And you connect a carrot to it, right? So, we had to attend the webinar prior to applying for funding. If people want funding from the ICTS, then we need to ensure that they are experiencing trainings related to cultural sensitivity and humility. I think you can also assess it and track it over time, and create some metrics towards where we want to be as an institution. Part of what I noticed coming to UCI is some of the trainings that were offered through OIE were, sign up if you're interested. Well, it becomes a group of us that all believe the same thing, and perhaps the folks that really need to hear the information aren't in the room. So it's just an observation.
What a salient one.
Yeah, let's put some teeth in it, right? And really attach it to things that people want. If you want this, then you got to do this.
Absolutely. I know we have like 3 minutes left, so I'm going to give the opportunity for anyone to ask one last question to Dr. Bounds before we give her day back.
I saw a hand that disappeared at some point. But I can't remember who it was.
Oh, Donovan.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I do have one more question, and this hopefully ties back into the question about trying to adapt this to Orange County. I do remember reading through the study that financial literacy was actually a key part of the training for participants, and I thought that was very unique, not only helping to improve with the intervention itself, but overall building kind of like the participant all around. But I was just wondering if before and after, whether socioeconomic status kind of was a good predictor or played a key role in sort of evaluating the attitude toward the intervention to begin with, as well as its effectiveness.
Great question. So we use the financial literacy program as a comparator. And to my knowledge, and I can share the paper where we share outcomes, I don't think SES was a factor in our outcomes. Surprisingly, age was though, and we had a range of fathers. So I want to say age was a factor, but SES was not in Chicago. Education may have also been a factor, but I can share, Donovan, I can send that paper maybe to Joni that shares the outcomes of that study.
Thank you.
Sure.
Wonderful. I know we're ending up here, but Dr. Bounds, Dawn, I really want to thank you for taking my email and agreeing to do this, and just, you know, just sharing your vision and heart around this particular population and this research, right? It helps us all be better as researchers. And so consider this an open invite. I'll take the liberty and say, you know, please come back and share some more information with us in the future. So.
Thanks for having
We've already put you on about 5 different committees, Dawn, just so
Oh,
you
no, just so
know.
you know, Dan is like, so the next iteration of the grant, what we'll do in element E is.
Thank you, Dr. Bounds. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the week.
You too.
Thank you.